Let's now use a third-party middleware function from npm called Morgan in order to make our development life a bit easier. So as I mentioned, we're going to use a middleware called Morgan, which is a very popular logging middleware. So a middleware that's going to allow us to see request data right in the console. Okay, so let me go ahead and install it, and you will then see how that works. Okay, so I don't want to now finish this process here, so I'm going to create a new terminal here in VS Code. And so for that, I hit this plus button here. And so now we get a new terminal. And I don't want to update, so no. And now npm install Morgan. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, this logging middleware is going to make our development life a bit easier. But it still is code that we will actually include in our application. And so that's why it's not a development dependency, but just a simple regular dependency. Okay, and so that's why I didn't specify save dev here, because again, it's not a dev dependency really. Okay, so we have it in our package.json here now, Morgan. And so let's go ahead and require it in our code. So again, right at the top here, const Morgan equals require Morgan. And you see again, this kind of convention that the require is going to expose is usually the same name as the package name itself. So we have our middlewares here. So let's add it right after these, or actually right as the first one. Okay. And our code is growing a little bit. So let's actually go ahead and add some comments here. So first, middlewares. Then down here, we start having our route handlers. Right. Then here, let's just say we have our routes. And then finally down here, we start the server. Okay, so just to make our code a bit more readable and easier to scan. So we have this first middleware, but again, let's use ours before that. So of course, app.use, and now in here we call Morgan. Okay, and into this function, we can pass an argument which will kind of specify how we want the logging to look like. So we can use some predefined strings for that, and the one that I'm going to use is called def. And actually you can see here the different options. So VS Code is really smart and can give me the options that we can pass into this function. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to use the one called def. Okay, and so that's actually it. So we required it, and then here we used it. So very simple stuff. But I think it's important to actually try to understand how this works. So calling this Morgan function will return a function similar to this one here, right? So that makes sense because, well, this is how a middleware function has to look like. And so let me actually prove that to you by looking at the source code for this package. And that's another very nice exercise from which we can actually learn quite a bit. So let's search for Morgan on GitHub. So usually all these packages are always on GitHub. And so that's where we can then look at their open source code. Okay, and Morgan is actually a very simple package. And so all we have to do is to go to this index.js file. So usually that is the entry point. And in this case, it's kind of the only file that there is. Okay, now I'm not going to go over all of this code, but I want to highlight that the main export from this file here is Morgan. So a function called Morgan. So let's look for that. And actually, here it is. Okay, and so when we require the package in our code, what will get returned is this Morgan function, right? Again, because they use module.export, and that is the default export, just like we learned in the requiring modules lecture 1 section or 2 sections ago, right? So again, this Morgan function here will be this Morgan function here in this code. Okay, so let's see what this function does. And I don't care about any of this implementation here. what I really want to show you is that this function actually returns another function, which is the logger. And you see that this function, just as our own middleware functions, has this very typical signature of request, response, and next. Okay? So this function is just like our own middleware functions. And so you see that actually in the end, when it's ready, it also calls next. So just like we do. So it's just a very regular middleware function, just like the ones that we write. Okay? So let's go back here, and let's now actually see the result here in our terminal. So let's go back to that first one. So this is how we switch between the different terminals that we have open in VS Code. Give us some more space here. Actually clear this out, because you might not be able to see the bottom of the screen so well. And so yeah, let's now go ahead and simply create some request. All right, go back, and here we go. So here we have the information about the request that we just did. So we get the HTTP method, we get the URL, we get the status code, the time it took to send back the response, and also the size of the response in bytes. So remember, we could have used another option here. For example, tiny was another one. So that would then probably look a bit different. And it actually looks kind of similar here. It simply doesn't do this coloring of the status code. And also it has a slightly different order here. Okay. And if we did something, if we caused an error, for example, a 404, let's test that out by using an invalid ID here. So that will then get another color here, right? Can see that? Let's do that again, just in case you didn't see it. And so, yeah, gives us a different color. And so, yeah, that can be quite useful for development. We could actually even save this log to a file, but that's a bit too much for this small example. So this is more than enough, and you will see throughout the course that it's kind of useful to actually have it here. Okay, so this is how we use third-party middleware from NPM, and there is a lot of middleware on there, and let me actually show that to you. So on the Express side itself, so expressjs.com, and we actually never visited this website, so it's actually quite nice. So you have this getting started with a couple of articles explaining the basics of Express, and then you have a nice API reference, in our case 4.x. And so here you have all of the methods that are on the request. So methods on properties, of course. So all of this stuff that we have. For example, request.body that we already used. Or here on the response, you have, for example, response.json or response.send. And there's a bunch of other methods, and we will use many of them later on. And then here you have these resources, and the one that I want to show you is middleware. And so this is a bunch of middleware that you can use and that Express recommends. Okay, and again, we will use some of them a bit later. And actually, Express recommends these because many of these used to be built in Express 3, so in the previous version, but were then taken out of Express. For example, body parser is one of them. But actually in version 4.14 or 16, it was added back. And so that's why we were able to do, let's see, where is it? Yeah, that's why we were able to use express.json in order to parse the data from the body. Before that, we actually would have to use the body parser from NPM and use that one to parse the data from the body. But again, they just recently added it back to reduce the confusion a bit for beginners like yourself. Okay, so play around a little bit with this reference. Take a look at some of the stuff maybe that we already did, if you feel like it. Or if not, you can always just move on right to the next video.